crying at church and the crying even, at mass for a prolonged time, the way I read it as part of your story is actually really positive rather than...
They were just, all that burden that I carried for so long. They were tears of relief. They were, it was just, I was falling in love. So what happened was I wound up falling in love, and I fell in love with Jesus and
That's beautiful.
And his church and the church he gave us.
Hello, everybody. Hello and welcome to the third episode of this Searching and Finding series. We have the honor today, I'm very, very privileged to have Faith, and my friend Faith here, who accepted very kindly to share with us her spiritual journey so far. And I cannot wait. I'm really excited about this episode, Faith. So thank you very much for being here.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. I would start with, probably from where our friendship comes from. We've met each other via internet and YouTube. We're both bookish people, both you and I. And I think it would be fair to say that both you and I, as Catholics, have been attracted or re-attracted to our faith through some books. Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so would you be willing to share with us, a little bit about that in terms of, at what point of your life that happened and how maybe, which particular readings were crucial for you?
Well, I mean, should I go back to when I was 12, there was a family tragedy, and it caused me to lose my faith. I suddenly realized that people told themselves to comfort themselves because death was too horrible. And I mean, it was a very existential crisis at 12. And so I really lost my faith there. And I would say that I didn't really come back to it. Not that I came back to the Catholic faith, but I came back to believing that there might be a higher power, maybe around 23. And then by the time I was 29, that's when I decided I really was Catholic. But I was raised Roman Catholic. So I went to Catholic schools, but because of this tragedy, it obliterated my trust and my faith, and so it was a very lonely, bleak experience. And the way I came back was it's very fuzzy, it's very complicated and subtle, and like looking back, I can see things. But I would say that when I went to college, I was a minor in philosophy, and the college was big on Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre. And when I first started reading Sartre, I loved him because someone was expressing exactly what my emotional experience had been. But by the time I graduated, I rejected him. And the reason why I rejected him is, and this is going to be really simplistic because I haven't read him in, 30 something years, but he, as long as his thing was, we have the I and you can never really know the other, and I felt that way. So the only thing that counted was authentic choice, that you had to make your own choice and had to be authentic. And the problem with that, I realized after I'd been studying for a while, all this existentialism, was that it put, Jean-Paul Sartre was a resistance fighter for the French in World War II. And he, that's a good thing, right? But if you really follow his philosophy through to its logical conclusion, if Hitler made the authentic choice to be anti-Semitic and try to wipe out the Jewish, commit genocide, since there is no good or evil, it's just your authentic choice, that makes no sense. Because you just intuit that there's a right and wrong.
Yeah.
think it was sort of studying philosophy, and I can't tell you exact books or whatever. I remember reading No Exit, but I can't tell you. I can't tell you exactly what I read, but I know that I went through that process in college where I thought that there had to be right and wrong, there had to be good and evil, and so I rejected existentialism, basically. So then after college, well, okay, here's a definite book. When I was in college, I remember one day I had to go see my advisor, and the guy had a newspaper clipping up on his door, and it was a column about Dorothy Day. And while I was waiting for him, I read it. She had just passed away, and I had not heard of her. And so I was so intrigued that when he opened the door, it was my turn to go in for my meeting. I asked him about it, and he said, "Oh, Dorothy Day," and he told me all about Dorothy Day. I later found out that my grandfather knew Dorothy Day, and
Oh my, that's interesting.
there's actually a newspaper article saying where Dorothy Day says, "My friend John Brophy," that was my grandfather, who was very involved in the labor movement, and had just gotten beaten up by some thugs or something when Dorothy Day was meeting.
Oh,
But anyway, so I mean that's just such a weird coincidence, right? But anyway, so I was really interested in Dorothy Day, and I remember I read *The Long Loneliness*, which is her memoir, and so that was a definite influence on me. What else influenced me?
you were saying at this point, you were about 29, 30?
Oh, this was when I was 1920.
Oh, interesting.
I started to think about if I was going to be Christian, if I did believe in God, what kind of person, what kind of belief would I have, And I think I was always attracted to people who were very service oriented, that they wanted to serve the poor, they wanted to right injustices, that sort of thing. So like at this time, I didn't read a book about her yet, but Mother Teresa was in the background. Like she had just gotten the Nobel Peace Prize, and I was really interested in her. So I remember anytime like she was on the cover of Time or whatever, anytime there was something about Mother Teresa, I wanted to read about it, read about her. So she was hovering in the background. Dorothy Day was there kind of in the background. And then I was also sort of exploring. So I took a class on Oriental philosophy. And I remember reading the Bhagavad Gita and about Zen and Taoism and all that kind of stuff. And we even had Buddhist monks come through the campus and stayed. They were protesting the nuclear bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and we actually marched. I actually marched with these Buddhist monks to Washington D.C. So that was I was sort of exploring Buddhism and all the Eastern stuff, but it didn't stick with me. It didn't feel right.
It's interesting though, because among the bookish people that I talked to about their spiritual path, the, let's say, exploration of Eastern philosophies and Eastern thought is always a recurring step in their research.
Well, I think if you're seeking, and I was seeking in a very not my heart wasn't really seeking. I wanted to puzzle it out why people believed in higher things,
Yeah,
And,
intellectually as well.
yeah, and so I was just I was just a college student taking a course. I don't know why it didn't stick with me. I can't really remember now. I remember I wasn't impressed by cones. The thing I remember they taught us the cone, what is the sound of one hand clapping? I remember thinking that's
cones.
like clap words, like clap means two things hitting each other. So it was like just a little semantic,
And sometimes to be, let's say, respectful,
yeah,
I'm pretty sure that there are nuances to Eastern thoughts and philosophies that when they are being popularized in the West,
yes.
they probably lose something, no? But it is what it is.
Yeah, probably because at this time, so this was back in the late 70s, early 80s, because of, I guess, the Beatles and all this stuff, Eastern religion and philosophy was very, very trendy. It was very, it was really influencing a lot of, celebrities and that sort of thing. So it was hard not to kind of be exposed to at least a
Yeah.
little.
George Harrison was crazy about that, right? I mean, all of the Beatles, they traveled there as well, right?
That was like more Hinduism, right, rather than Buddhism. But yeah, so and Hare Krishna. I remember I had George Harrison's Hare Krishna.
Yeah.
I listened to that. So another book I think that really influenced me, and I'm going to read it again. I'm so excited to do that. But when I was so I graduated from college and I came home. I lived at home for 3 years. I don't know what I was reading during that time, but when then I decided to go to law school. And when I was in law school, I met a girl who I'd actually known before, and she was very radical. She had been in the Peace Corps, and she was involved with Dorothy Day's the Catholic Worker House.
All right.
Baltimore. So Baltimore at that time, I don't know if it had sort of a radical Catholic underground. It was kind of left over from the Berrigans. You remember the Berrigan? There was Father Berrigan, and his brother was also a priest, but then he left, Daniel Berrigan, and they were very anti-Vietnam, and they burned their draft cards, and it was a big thing. And so there was this sort of, I went to law school in Baltimore. So there was this kind of very, kind of radical Catholic social thing, justice going on there. And she was involved in that. And I remember either she gave me a book or I went and bought it, but it was The Seeds of Contemplation by Thomas Merton.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't really understand it. I was really puzzled by it. But I remembered that my father had his book, The Seven-Story Mountain. So when I would go home to visit my parents, who were in Northern Virginia, and I was in Baltimore, I would pick up that book and read chunks of it. And it was very, very stirring because Thomas Merton was really secular, and he was like an artist. He grew up in with his parents were artists, and they died young, and then came back to New York, was raised by his grandparents, but he was very secular. And the whole story of how he was attracted to Catholicism and then eventually becomes a monk. So that was a very gripping story. And I didn't read all of it, though. So I want to read it from cover to cover. But I just remember coming home and reading that. Another thing that I read back in that time period was Pope John Paul II's, I don't know what the actual term is. It wasn't an encyclical because he wrote it before he was Pope, but it was called Love and Responsibility. And very, very theologically dense. And I could barely grasp it. But it was basically about the sex revolution and the role of sex in human life, And it was hard to grasp, but I remember reading it because the world was pretty disillusioning. It was hard to be out there trying to find a mate and all that stuff. It was really, really screwed up, And so I just remember that sort of really impressed me. So it wasn't like I was doing like this deep research where I was reading. I would read chunks here. I would hear something there, and I would read it. And it was very slow and subtle, and I'm not quite sure how it happened, but somehow I got to a certain point where I realized that I believed there was a creator more than I didn't believe there was a creator.
And in your life, in that moment, when you realized that was happening, was something happening in your life that was different from before, or did it just simply grow inside you?
I think it was just growing, but I wasn't aware of it, And then when it happened, when I realized that it was probably, I was so influenced probably by my mother, who was very devout, and and she was smart, and she believed, like and so probably she influenced me a lot. So where I gradually came around again, because she was such a strong person and she had so many tragedies in her life, and she turned to God. Now, she was a very reserved person, so she didn't, you could have conversations with her, but it was a little bit hard. She found it hard to share, but she modeled it. She modeled it. And so that was always there.
Yeah.
So maybe that was it, but I wish I could say there was a point. It was like I suddenly recognized it. That and I really started to seek to try to learn about different faiths. And so I for about a year I was listening to prayers from a sheikh who was Sufi Islam.
Ah,
For about a year, I had a Walkman and I would listen to these beautiful prayers, absolutely gorgeous prayers. But then when I would study about Muhammad, and it didn't do it for me. And I was always attracted to Judaism, just because when I was, 13, I read the Diary of Anne Frank, and that started me on a reading streak of all sorts of Holocaust literature. And I remember I loved Isaac Bashevis Singer, who's a Hasidic
yes.
writer. So I loved all that stuff. And so Judaism seemed attractive to me. And then I actually went to different, like I would go to an Episcopal church one Sunday, and then I'd go to a Methodist, but I wasn't attracted to I wasn't very good at being Protestant because they just struck me as watered down Catholicism. And I would think if I do believe, and if it winds up, I actually do believe in Jesus, I'm going to go straight to the source. I didn't. So I wasn't very. I don't think I was very open minded about Protestantism. Um, and then what else happened? So then I met my husband. We started dating. He's Jewish. He was raised Jewish, but his parents were pretty atheistic. I know his mother was an atheist. I don't know about his father. Is maybe agnostic, but he did. He was bar mitzvahed and everything. And so when we decided to get married, we decided we would try to be Unitarian Universalists. So at the time, I was very left wing politically, except I never accepted abortion as a good thing. And in the back of my mind, I always admired the church for never changing its tune on that. So that's controversial. I don't know if you want to put that out there, but
Oh, no, it's not controversial with me.
even though I was hanging out with really left wing people, but I knew that I was the only one that really questioned abortion. So so now I forget what I was saying. What was
Well,
this?
so far you've really painted this quick fresco, which is in itself it could be made into a great novel, in my opinion, right? Because there is the growth, the drama when you were young, and we can think of all the young kids who face a tragedy, who face a drama, and emotionally they're not equipped to say, oh, I have this personality already built to face this. Who does at 12 years old, right? So you have this train wreck, and that moves you around until the almost necessary facing existentialism, facing the greatest poet of desperation, who is Sartre, one of the greatest, and then but you moved on and you kept searching and looking around with great curiosity. And something else that really strikes me is the role of your mother, almost as Saint Helen. If you think about Saint Helen as Saint Augustine's mother, she you can see her presence through every single page of the Confessions.
Yeah.
Even when he doesn't talk about her, she is that rock in his world, and not only emotionally but also intellectually. He keeps going around and circling around, and then that's where he went back, and it sounds like that's where you went back as well.
Yeah. Now I will tell you that during this time, I felt very alienated from the church, and I was very, very judgmental because I saw a lot of hypocrisy. So I had a lot of anger at the church itself. So I went through Catholic schools and I didn't believe. And this was post-Vatican II, and the implementation of Vatican II, as we can see in hindsight, was abysmal. And there was just so many shocking things that went on. Like, I remember one year there was mostly nuns teaching in our school, and then the next year it was only the old senile nuns, and all the other nuns were gone. One year we would go to confession like every couple of Saturdays. You were scooted over to the church, and then suddenly there was no confession anymore. You didn't go to confession anymore for some reason. And stuff like that happened. And also at this time, and I think I was an early teen, one of the priests in our parish committed suicide. And the room he was found in the bathroom of his male lover. So, I'd seen up on the altar, and we had several scandals like that, where we had a pastor that we thought he was the weirdest, meanest pastor. And I remember my mother saying, there's something wrong with that man. And years later, he was arrested for child porn, and he's in prison now. So there were so many things going on in the church at the time. And then when I went to college, I went to Mount St. Mary's University. It was college back then. And that has a seminary there. Now, they've cleaned it up since, I've heard. But I was friends with a seminarian who would come over and complain to me about all the homosexual activity going on in the seminary. So I was hearing all this awful stuff and experiencing, and I just saw the church as a rotten institution that was just rife with corruption and hypocrisy. People who said one thing but did something completely opposed. So I had that made it hard to come back to. And I think what happened was, as I was searching, and I was looking at Judaism, and I was looking at Islam, and then looking at other different Christian faiths, because I guess I decided I was a monotheist, that I did believe there was a creator.
It's something.
Yeah. I think while I was doing all that, I somehow, maybe I got mature enough, I began to be able to separate the institution of the church from the teachings of the church. So I love the teachings of the church, because I've always instinctively been a consistent life ethic kind of person. I didn't know that term until much later. And, but so like I always question abortion, but I was always against the death penalty too. Like I had certain things that I felt very strongly about. And it turned out so when I came back to the church, I came back through an organization called Pax Christi, which I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a group that wants to make the church a church of nonviolence. Okay. So it's who is it very influenced? It's very influenced by like the Berrigans and Dorothy Day and those types of people, those types of Catholics.
Did it have any connection with the nonviolent civil rights movement or with era?
Very much so, yeah. It sort of came out of that. So I got married in the Unitarian Church. And then, but I decided I didn't want to be Unitarian, mostly because if you're Unitarian, I mean, abortion is practically a tenet of their church. And I just didn't feel comfortable. And my husband, even though he didn't know what he believed, he kept saying, they're going to say, may the force be with you. It just, and so we didn't feel comfortable in it. So we tried, but then that fell apart too. And then one morning I was walking, one Sunday morning, I decided to take a walk, and I was walking and I walked by a church that I'd never been in, and it was Catholic church. And I saw that Mass was just starting. And so I went in, and the very first words I heard out of the priest's mouth was, everyone who walks through these doors should feel welcomed. That's what he said. I later got to know him. And I thought, well, that's something. And I sat down, and he was saying Mass, and I just started crying. And I cried at Mass for like the next 5 years. But that was when I decided I was home. for some
Yeah.
reason. I joined Pax Christi. So in the bulletin, or maybe he made an announcement. We said we have an organization, Pax Christi. Anyone interested? So I thought, well, this sounds interesting to me. So I joined the Pax Christi group, and I met all these great people, and it really, it was so good, because we would just sit and talk and talk and talk. There was a nun who was in it, not a nun, a sister who was in it, and she was great, Sister Anne. And I had a good friend, Judith, who's since passed away. And I forget the other ladies. We were a very small group. Sometimes Father Tuck would join us, he was the priest.
But the crying at church, and the crying even at mass for a prolonged time, 5 years you say, the way I read it as part of your story is actually really positive rather than anything, right?
Cleansing tears. They were just, all that burden that I carried for so long. They were tears of relief. They were it was just, I was falling in love. So what happened was I wound up falling in love, and I fell in love with Jesus, and
That's beautiful.
and his church, and the church he gave us.
Yeah.
And head over heels, just head over heels, and I haven't fallen out yet. And all the time I was searching and going, no.
It's lovely, because if we think about moments in our lives when we have actually fallen in love with a partner, with our spouse, etc., it's pretty common that at least once or twice there have been crying moments, because we get to the bottom. We get to the bottom of our emotional universe, and say, okay, when it comes to meeting a person, that's one thing, but when it comes to between yourself and the world or the universe and existence, that is not as easy, and it can be very complex depending on your experience. So that kind of meeting, finally feeling that you've reached that bottom, that almost like there is a maze, and then there is only one spot with a perfect circle for yourself only, and you found that in this church is just beautiful, really beautiful.
Yeah, and I couldn't articulate it very well, but I just found my people. I found people that I could really talk deeply about the faith, and I was really learning. It was like, because the other result of the bad implementation of Vatican II was that the catechesis in my schools became so bad. I don't recall learning anything about St. Thomas Aquinas until I got to college. Like, somehow I made it through 12 years of Catholic education, and I couldn't recall St. Thomas Aquinas. That's crazy, right? It was so bad that the catechesis just went out the window. I don't know better before, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, because I don't know, coming from a different country, but was it better before? Do we know if it was better before?
So, because I have older sisters who have left the faith. I mean, they've become Protestant, or they're nothing, and they all got the Baltimore Catechism drilled into them and all that stuff. So I don't think so. I think the church was going through a real upheaval with modernity, and upheavals aren't just a few years. You can go through an upheaval for 100 years, and I think it's a long-term upheaval. And I think the church just lost its bearings. It was doing rote stuff, and then it decided to do groovy stuff. And the rote stuff had depth, but it was boring and didn't seem to apply to modern life. And the groovy stuff was fluff, and it didn't stick with you. They didn't. I think they're much better now. I think they've kind of figured it out. But at the time, so I remember about 10 years ago, I went back to an elementary school reunion, and I met it with two girls that I had been my friends, and we were walking around the school. Everything looked so tiny and weird, because you remember it when you were a kid, and then you come back, everything looks so different. But we noticed that all the kids had learned about saints. There were all sorts of paintings of saints and essays about the saints. And we turned to each other and we said, did we learn about saints?
No idea.
You jettison that rich heritage in a Catholic education. It was like, I read an article somewhere where somebody said we was robbed, because they didn't really get a Catholic education, even though their parents were sending them to Catholic school. I think it went through a real nadir, where it was just not doing what it was supposed to do. I think it's better now. My grandson goes to the school at our parish now, and it's much better. They have
Yeah.
a better handle on how to do things. But when I was there, it was paltry.
Yeah, that's good. And let's also admit there are many more informational tools, including YouTube, right? For kids, for young people, or older people who want to learn about Catholicism, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, it used to be books, books and newspapers, and you would read the Catholic, like we got America magazine, I remember, and yeah, or you could read the Catholic Worker or something. You could read something like that, and there were always like, I mean, I remember my mother took a class on I'm not going to say his name, Teilhard de Chardin.
Oh,
She was
yeah. Oh, yes.
she was really interested in him. And so I remember she took a class on him and we had many of his books. She was really fascinated by him. So you could still do stuff, somebody would be giving a course and you had to, show up at the church, but they still, and I know she did scripture studies,
Yeah.
even 70s and 80s, that was going on. So
Teilhard de Chardin is in some circles in the church maybe a little controversial, but he was a paleontologist, he was a great scientist, and he was also loved by his work, was loved by Joseph Ratzinger, by
yeah,
Pope Benedict. So as a consequence, I love his work.
he was trying to resolve evolution,
Yeah,
with,
bring it together,
yeah,
science and faith.
yeah, he was a scientist, and unfortunately, he got caught up in some kind of scandal, the Peking Man or something. There was
Yeah,
a falsification and I don't think he was directly involved, but I think he got tainted because he was associated with the people who were involved, something like
right.
that.
You're right.
But he was very, very abstract, very abstract thinker. But I would love to try to study him now, and I'm excited about the introduction to Christianity because he mentions.
Yeah.
So
I,
I'm
I read
looking.
somewhere that in the Introduction to Christianity, Pope Ratzinger quotes Teilhard de Chardin at least 7 or 8 times,
Oh,
more than many others. Um,
that's what I like about the church, even like with who is it, like Origin or something. There are controversial people, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. They might have been really good at certain aspects and then miss the mark on others, and you know that's okay. You don't have to be, you don't have to read. It's not all or nothing. In
yeah,
other
yeah. You said something about the church, which is something that, you said as you matured, maybe you started really being able to look at the church as the people on one hand, and then the church as an institution, which reminds me, even 700 years ago in Italy, Dante had the same problem, and he said he differentiated the Pope from the throne or the seat of the Pope. And in his, I think, which is a very Orthodox Catholic principle, they are two different, very different things. One is the bride of Christ, and that's the church. And the other is a sinful human being. So very, very different.
Yeah, yeah, and that makes so much sense, doesn't it? It really makes sense when you become a parent. I think for me it was like revelation because your kid can be awful. You know, he or she is still your kid, right? You're still, and so you can distinguish between, what's the official authoritative thing versus the what's going on right now. kind of the more temporal, you know, misbehaviors or where it's gone off the rails or whatever. But it doesn't change the actual fact that you're, you know, parent and child, right? So I think that so yeah, so when I got into Pax Christi, I really started studying the more of the teachings of the church, and then I even met. I have to tell you this because this is, as a Catholic, you might find this exciting, but I went to a one-day retreat given by Father Emmanuel Charles McCarthy, who was Melkite priest, who was the father of the, because Melkites at that time could marry and have children, and his youngest daughter, I think it was his youngest daughter, was the miracle that allowed the sainthood of Edith Stein.
Oh, okay. Now I'm connecting the dots.
Yeah, yeah. So he told us all about that. So I got to hear from him about this miracle that happened to his daughter. And they had all prayed because he named his daughter Benedicta after Edith Stein, after, because he really had a thing for her. He really liked her. He had a devotion to her. And so they had named their daughter Benedicta. And so when she ate too much. When she was a little toddler, she ate Tylenol, and she was going to die. And he and his wife told everybody, please pray for intercession from Edith Stein or Saint Teresa Benedicta. And now she's Saint Teresa Benedicta. She became a nun, so she was, I don't know if you want me to go into all this. She was Jewish. She was raised in an Orthodox Jewish family. She became a philosopher. She studied under Husserl, and then and became an atheist. And then she converted to Catholicism after reading, I think it was Saint Teresa of Avila.
The Interior Castle.
Is that what she read?
Yeah.
She read it in one night and she converted. And then she eventually became a Carmelite nun. And then she was killed in, was it Auschwitz or somewhere? She was killed in the Holocaust. Yeah. So anyway, so that was he had a special devotion to her. And so he and his wife had named his daughter Benedicta. So they asked her intercession. This was before she was an actual saint. So what, servant of God or whatever the other title is. Anyway, that was the coolest experience, talking to
Wow.
experience this miracle and the reason why Edith Stein was elevated to sainthood. So, yeah.
I bet. And then, Faith, there is one element, let's say, of your spirituality that I know because I talked to you before, that is very important in your spiritual life, and we can call it the love and respect for the environment, but it's very beautifully summarized in one encyclical letter that is very dear to you, right?
Yeah. So after I got out of Pax Christi, I started having children, and I wound up homeschooling them. So I got into really conservative Catholic homeschooling world, which was wonderful. I learned so much, and I made good friends, and it was wonderful. And I homeschooled my kids for 21 years.
Oh, wow.
But I wouldn't trade it for anything. But then as my kids were growing up and moving away, I was getting really disillusioned just politically, because we have such a terrible political culture right now. And so, but God is so merciful, because when I was going through this time of just wondering where I belonged, or feeling really at odds with the people that I'd been friends with for so many years, and just disagreeing with them very deeply on political things. My church they were going to read this encyclical, and they invited people to come to a study group, and it's on care for our common home. And I've always loved nature. I've always communed with nature, and so I thought, oh, this sounds great. And I'd always been sort of a little bit of an environmentalist, and well, that's a whole other journey. But I'd always felt like we needed to take better care of the earth, that we shouldn't be so reckless the way we are. And so when I studied this, it was just, every word was just gold. Yeah, I just really, it really convicted me all over again. It was like I fell in love all over again. And you know, it's not that I think Pope Francis is the perfect pope or anything like that, but he really hit it out of the ballpark with this one. And
Yeah.
um, and so since I started my BookTube channel I mean, I guess I'm been on BookTube for 3 years, maybe, or is it 4? I don't even know. But anyway, last July, I started this thing called Sustainability July, where I just wanted to focus on trying everybody doing their best to live a little more gently, to be slightly better stewards of this incredible gift that God has given us, the only place we know where life exists. And you know, humans need the earth, and we're part of the earth, right? We're the pinnacle of creation, but we are created, you know. So we're connected, and we need it.
Yeah,
And
connection is the the accent of interconnectedness. I think is a very beautiful focus of that encyclical. Right, it keeps saying that everything is connected, all the creatures.
yes, and he very much emphasized that caring for the poor involves caring for the earth and vice versa, because when we destroy the earth, who gets it first? It's the poor. You know, they're the ones that get exploited. They're the ones that suffer. You know, and so if you care about the poor, you're going to care about where they live, right? Are they living in places where the waters are so polluted, or you know, so it makes sense. So it's hear the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth at the same time. So I love the way he connects it. He doesn't see humans as like separate and then the earth's over here. No, it's all connected. So
Yeah,
I really, and you know, he relies a lot on Pope Benedict's teachings and John Paul II's teachings. So it's not like he just came along and decided to be groovy and, you know, be invited. It's basing it on real Catholic teaching, you know.
yeah.
So anyway, so we're going to read this July. We're going to go through and
This is
read.
a 2015 encyclical, correct? And is it your favorite encyclical for at least for the last?
Most. I think I've only read chunks of other encyclicals, and then I also did read his Fratelli Tutti. I
Yeah,
think I read that one as well, and I've read, you know, bits and pieces of other encyclicals like Rerum Novarum. Is that what it is? The labor one?
Rerum Novarum, yes.
Novarum. Thank you, Rerum Novarum. Yeah, I've read that one too as well. And I think I've read bits and pieces of others, but yeah, this one I've read the most. So yeah,
Let's recommend it to anybody who's listening because I'm sure it's a very constructive read, right?
oh, it really is. It really is. He out very clearly, and it's got practical aspects of it, but it's also theologically sound. So it's good. It's really good. So
Everything is connected. All the creatures, all animals, all plants, and everything that's been created on this earth. Everything is connected.
if you study it, it's absolutely majestic. You know, it's just the complexity and the beauty. It's amazing. It's just amazing, and so it's well worth saving, and we really should include it in our daily lives. You know, that should be a strong thing that drives how we behave every day, what we do. So yeah.
Yeah, and let me conclude with this type of encouragement. We have these encyclicals that the church has been publishing for, I mean, centuries and centuries. But just like you said, our regular education does not maybe encourage us too much to go and study them. But let's do it anyway because it's so worth it, right?
Yeah, it really is. I think that, you know, when you're in love with somebody, you want to know them and talk to them, and with God, you know, prayer, but also reading. You know, you can study. You actually can study. There are these great thinkers who've gone before and really can give so much insight. And you know, so for me, I always like to be reading something like my mother. My mother was like that, and I always want to be reading something theological or something, religion based, or because it's just that much deeper. Your life is that much deeper, and it really enriches the whole relationship. For me, anyway, it really does. So
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my, this was such a enriching and honestly life-giving conversation. I hope that people who watch will notice this as well. So
I'm
huge, huge thanks to you.
talk to
No, this is great. This is great, Faith. Thank you again so much. It's been a great pleasure for being available and so open. So huge, huge thanks. Grazie from me.
I forget how to say.
The response in Italian is prego.
Prego, that's right. I knew that. I knew that.
Thank you again.